Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and we return to 1980 and the film novelizations this time around. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler. This time, what we're looking at is the second novelization of a Star Wars film, which is also the fifth Star Wars novel coming from Del Rey, before their contract ends after the Lando Calrissian adventures a little while later on. The book in question, if you haven't guessed yet, is Donald F. Glut's novelization of The Empire Strikes Back. This is the original paperback edition of it. The blue cover, as opposed to, say, a white one. There are several different variants that are very similar to this. Originally released, as with all the other Del Rey books of the time, in paperback. This one in particular is special to me. It is a signed copy here, just like I've got Alan Dean Foster's signature on that omnibus edition of the A New Hope book, and then I've got that hardback sci-fi book club one signed by Anthony Forrest. I was fortunate enough to get one of the limited edition signed versions of The Empire Strikes Back, signed by Donald F. Glut. This is number 955 of a special edition limited to 1,000 as a collector's edition. Otherwise, aside from the stamp there and the signature, I mean, it's just a standard edition here. Originally released in paperback, though, if you are looking for an early version of it in hardback, again, the Sci-Fi Book Club did again do its own hardback version, but in this case, I mean, the covers are pretty much the same. There's not that huge variance in covers that we saw with A New Hope, and we won't see that kind of variance again either with Return of the Jedi. It'll be basically the same type of cover. Now, what you have here is pretty much what you would expect. It is a pretty good novelization of The Empire Strikes Back. Donald F. Glut does a good job of describing the action here. It's of the three of the novelizations of the classic trilogy, this one actually is pretty good. Return of the Jedi is fairly good. I would say that A New Hope is the one that's the most off from the terms of writing style and the fact there's a lot more different between that and its film than these two and their films. Because, of course, at this point, people have seen the original Star Wars films, they know what to expect, and that means the writers have seen it as well and know what the readers expect. Although you do still have some oddities here. One of the things we see in this, for instance, is that Yoda is described as blue. Now, that's probably an issue with some of the early drafts of the script and some of the early artwork that was given to Donald F. Glut and given to, among other people, the comic book writers and such. So it wound up being sort of a description that was true maybe at one time, but not throughout the entire creative process. So he's described as blue, but hey, it's Yoda. He's new to The Empire Strikes Back. We can sort of take that as a given that, yeah, sometimes there's going to be little errors like that. Fine. No big deal. That's just an issue of production. On the other hand, Darth Vader's lightsaber at one point is also described as blue, and that makes no sense for anybody who's seen A New Hope. So in that sense, we do have a color issue here that seems odd. And I mean, a color issue, not something we see, of course, something that is described in the book. This book also includes some other oddities in terms of longer-running continuity. For instance, we're all familiar at this point with the X-Wing Rogue Squadron pilot, Derek "Hobby" Clivian. He's a long-running member of Rogue Squadron. We see him in the comics, we see him in the novels. He is a part of the Rebel Alliance post-Battle of Endor. But not if this novel had had its way. Based on an earlier draft of the Empire Strikes Back script, as opposed to what wound up finally showing up on film, of course, in theaters, and then down the line on home video, we have a scene in here in which both Veers and Hobby die, because Hobby flies his snowspeeder into the head of the AT-AT walker that General Veers, Maximilian Veers, is commanding, and boom! They both die. So, Hobby, as of this point, everybody thinks that he is dead. But that will, of course, change in later continuity. They'll turn around and say, well, that didn't appear in the film itself, therefore, it didn't happen. Even though it's mentioned in the novelization of it, sorry, film trumps novelization, and usually, if it's an added scene, it's okay, but since other continuity later contradicted it, nah, we're tossing it out. That novel scene doesn't actually exist. Of course, we also have some other variants here. The good news is that, unlike the way that it gets quoted all the time in the media, we don't have a Luke, I am your father instance here. Okay, rewind it. Yes, he says he's his father. But the classic thing is, Luke, I am your father. You hear that all the time in pop culture, even though the film says, no, I am your father. Not Luke, but no, I am your father, while he happens to be talking to Luke. There is no word Luke, though, in that statement. You see that sometimes adaptations will wind up playing on that. We'll see that in the comic adaptation, for instance. But in here, no, it's true to the film. It says, no, I am your father. So anyone who says, Luke, I'm your father, is not taking it from this source. But they may have from the comic, as we'll see in the near future on another episode of From the Star Wars Library. Another thing here that's a little bit jarring, of course, is one of those classic Han Solo moments. We all know the story at this point of how on set, Harrison Ford ad-libbed the line, "I know." So Leia says, "I love you." He says, "I know," and then of course that gets picked up again in reverse in Return of the Jedi. But that was an ad-libbed line from Harrison Ford, so it wasn't in any of the scripts. Which also means it doesn't show up in the novelization that is based on those scripts and was being produced while the film itself was still being produced. You'll find the exchange on page 179 of the original paperback, in which Leia says, "I love you. I couldn't tell you before, but it's true." Han smiles his cocky smile and answers not "I know," but "Just remember that, because I'll be back." And then his face grows tender and he kisses her gently on the forehead. So he hasn't been yanked away from her yet at that point, at least the way it played out in the novelization. It's a subtle difference, but of course with that being such a major dialogue moment in the film, it is a little bit jarring. Yes, there are differences. Yes, it's based on something earlier. There are certain aspects of it that aren't quite the same as it is in the film. On the other hand, we get more information about the Rebel base, for instance, on Hoth. We get more information about Luke's Jedi training in here because they're able to play with it a little bit more, describe it a little bit more in narration rather than having to show us each individual segment on film. So it is worth reading, I think. It's worth reading to get that extra background and to get a good example of what an early novelization could be, especially if you were put off by some of the glaring differences and some of the oddities of the A New Hope novelization. Donald F. Glut does a good job with this. And remember, this is not Donald F. Glut's first time writing in the Star Wars universe. He's best known for this. You ask someone, what did Donald F. Glut write in Star Wars? They would say this, and most of the time, nothing but this. He did write Marvel issue number 10, Behemoth from the World Below, back in that first post-A New Hope story arc in the Marvel series. So he's not a newbie to Star Wars. He just hasn't written much in Star Wars yet, and he does a pretty good job with this, though he will not tend to return to Star Wars in the future. This pretty much is his swan song for the series. So is the novelization of The Empire Strikes Back by Donald F. Glut an essential read? The film, of course, is an essential part of the Star Wars saga. This book, unfortunately, is not. You could simply watch the movie. Pretty much any of the novelizations are not going to be essential reads, so there's one that may wind up going in a different direction. We'll see that many, many, many years from now in our coverage and many episodes from now in the episodes of From the Star Wars Library. Suffice to say, though, it's a good read. It's a nice read. You can read this after having seen the film and get a little bit more out of it that won't really add much to your knowledge of the film, but it'll add a little bit to it, and it's kind of neat to see how it plays out here. Good book, just not essential. With that, we'll close out this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.